Boldwood presents Kindred Spirits at Harling Hall, written by Sharon Booth and read by Karen Cass. Ghosts of Rowan Vale, Book 1. For all the ones we've loved and lost, forever in our hearts. Chapter 1. As the train pulled slowly into the station, I felt a pang of regret that the journey had ended so soon. I'd been looking forward to my first ever ride on a steam train for weeks, and it had lived up to all my expectations. Sitting here in this elegant compartment with its plush burgundy seats, overhead luggage racks and sliding door, my heart had soared, along with my imagination, as I'd gazed out of the window at the clouds of steam from the engine and seen myself in another age, one of smart clothes, well-mannered people, and schoolchildren who sat quietly and patiently as the teachers requested, instead of arguing, crunching noisily on boiled sweets, or making sarcastic comments about boring school trips. The coach journey from Lowerthorpe Primary School in Leicestershire to the Cotswold's town of Much Melton, where we'd caught the train, had seemed to last an awful lot longer than an hour and a half. I didn't envy the teachers, who had to deal with some of these kids every day. I'd only volunteered to accompany the class on this school trip because it was an opportunity to spend time with my daughter, Immy. What with work and school, I hardly saw anything of her these days, so I was hoping this excursion would be a bonding exercise. I glanced at my little girl, who wasn't so little any longer. Immy had taken no notice of the views from the window, nor had she shown much excitement about travelling on a steam train. She and her friend Violet were far too engrossed in the game they were playing on their mobile phones. I hadn't wanted to get Immy a phone at all, but she'd begged and pleaded, telling me that everyone in her class owned one, and she was practically a social outcast because she wasn't on Snapchat. I'd finally given in and bought her a reconditioned phone last year for her 10th birthday. There's nothing so persuasive as a kid's emotional blackmail, especially when you already have a terrible feeling that, as a mother, you're just not cutting it. The door slid open and Immy's teacher, Mr. Gaskell, quickly scanned the compartment. A short, balding man in his mid-50s, he'd always struck me as an amiable sort of bloke, and Immy seemed to like him. "Everything okay?" he asked. Whether he was addressing me or the 6 children who were with me, I wasn't sure. Either way, he hurried on without waiting for an answer. "We're pulling into Harling's halt now, so you can gather your coats and bags, please. We'll be getting off the train in a minute. When we do, I want you to form an orderly queue on the platform so I can do a head count. Miss Chase, can you see that they do, please?" He gave me a brief smile as I nodded. "The bus will leave for Rowan Vale from the station car park. You'll all have 10 minutes to use the toilet facilities, and 10 minutes only, so no loitering, okay?" He eyed them all sternly to emphasise his point, then slid the door shut again, before making his way to the next compartment, presumably to deliver the same speech to its occupants. There were 24 children on this trip, along with the teachers, Mr. Gaskell and Mrs. Ledbury, another volunteer mum called Diana Goodyear, and me. Each adult had taken responsibility for 6 children on the train. I could only hope that between us, we'd managed to keep control of them all when they were let loose in an unsuspecting Rowan Vale. "Okay, you heard Mr. Gaskell," I said cheerfully. "Coats and bags, please." There were a few chaotic moments as the children grabbed their belongings and headed for the door. I collected a couple of sweet wrappers and an empty crisp packet from the floor, shoved them in my jacket pocket, and followed my charges into the corridor. They'd been joined by their classmates from the other compartments, as well as Diana and Mrs. Ledbury, who were chatting animatedly about a new brand of lipstick they'd discovered, which, apparently, had incredible staying power and didn't even leave a mark on a cup. Mr. Gaskell called for everyone to follow him. The children jostled and pushed each other a bit, vying to be the first off the train, but overall they weren't too bad. I brought up the rear, automatically counting all the heads as we moved forward, even though I knew Mr. Gaskell would do it again when we disembarked. Finally, I stepped onto the platform at Harling's Halt and gazed around in delight. I hadn't realised that the station would be part of the Rowan Vale experience, although I should have. It was, after all, part of the Harling estate, which included the village, owned by a man called Sir Lawrence Davenport. According to the website, when the line between Harling's Holt and the market town of Much Melton had closed in the 1960s, Sir Edward Davenport, Lawrence's father, had stepped in and purchased it, along with a couple of vintage steam trains. The Davenports had operated the private line between the two stations ever since. Harling's Holt was where many visitors to Rowan Vale began their journey to the village. This was where they'd catch one of the vintage buses that would take them on a 10-minute ride to their destination. A privately owned village nestled on a large estate in the Cotswold countryside where modern vehicles were banned, staff dressed up in period costume from several eras, and many of the old buildings were used for their original purpose. As Mr. Gaskell counted the children for a second time, I looked around the little railway station, cheerfully decorated with bunting, hanging baskets and flower pots. Signs directed passengers to the Victory tea rooms, as well as a waiting room, ticket office and toilets. But what really grabbed my attention were the people in period costume on the platform. "Ooh," Diana said. "It's like the railway children." It was a bit, what with the Harling's Holt version of Mr. Perks, the station porter, who was pacing up and down in his uniform, looking every inch as if he'd stepped out of the film. However, despite that, there was no doubt that the station was dedicated to the First World War era. Union flag bunting was strung along the buildings, recruitment posters were pinned to the walls and stuck to the windows of the waiting room, and the faint chorus of "It's a Long Way to Tipperary" could be heard as if from a distance. Ladies in ankle-length skirts and dresses and wide-brimmed hats, and many men in First World War uniform strolled along the platform, while others stood around in groups, chatting. Obviously they were actors employed by the estate, but I could almost believe they were truly discussing the latest news from the front or preparing to say an emotional goodbye to their loved ones. This place was already beginning to cast its spell on me. Maybe it would work its magic on the kids too. I glanced hopefully at Immy, but she was chatting to Violet and didn't seem too interested in her surroundings. I sighed inwardly. Well, I thought it was fascinating, even if not everyone appreciated it. Those uniforms looked so authentic. I jumped as Mr. Gaskell said my name loudly, and to my embarrassment, I realised everyone was staring at me. "Sorry, yes. No. I mean, what?" Diana grinned. "All the nice girls love a soldier," she whispered, giving me a playful nudge. "I asked if you or Mrs. Goodyear would mind accompanying the girls to the toilets while I escort the boys," Mr. Gaskell explained patiently. "Mrs. Ledbury is going to the pick-up point to check on the travel arrangements to the village." "Of course, no problem." "I'll go with you," Diana said. "I'm getting that desperate, there'll be a puddle on the ground if we don't hurry up." "Oh, Mum!" Her daughter Katie's face turned scarlet as some of the boys howled with laughter at her embarrassment. Mrs. Ledbury, who could apparently retain water like a camel, headed through the archway to the coach and car park to check if the bus had arrived yet. Diana, Mr. Gaskell and I herded the children to the ladies or gents as appropriate. After using the facilities myself, I waited outside for the rest of the girls. Immy and Violet soon returned to the platform, followed by Mr. Gaskell and most of the other children. Mrs. Ledbury hurried back through the arch. "The bus stops at the entrance to the coach park," she informed us, "and the bus is ready and waiting." She glanced at her watch. "Maybe we ought to head there now. Would one of you mums mind waiting for the stragglers while we settle the rest of the children on the bus?" "I'll do that," I said, glad of the opportunity to take a few more moments to soak up the atmosphere at Harling's Holt. Immy looked at me uncertainly. "Shall I wait with you?" "No, it's okay," I assured her. "You go ahead with the others." As Diana and the two teachers herded the kids through the archway, I leaned against the wall, feeling genuine contentment. It really was like stepping back in time here, and this was just the station. What would the actual village be like? It was a gorgeous sunny day in early April. There were just a few more days until the spring term ended. As well as today, I'd booked next week off work so I could spend the first part of the Easter holidays with my daughter, and I couldn't wait. Violet's mum, Mel, usually looked after Immy if my working hours clashed with school holidays. She had 4 children of her own and said one more was no bother. I'd been lucky as the agency that employed me as a carer was very accommodating around the hours I worked, but I certainly didn't get as many holidays as Immy did, and since I was a single parent with little cash to spare on childcare, Mel had been a godsend. Immy would be going up to secondary school in September, which felt like a huge change in our lives. It was making me think about the future and the direction I wanted it to go in. My options were limited, but my once dormant ambition was growing like Japanese knotweed. I wanted a job that would give me more time at home, but would also pay enough to make life less of a financial struggle. And if I was being really greedy, I'd put a bigger flat for Immy and me on the wish list. Maybe even a house with a garden. Yeah, right, Callie, good luck with that. I mentally shook my head. I was living in a dream world. Jobs like that didn't exist. Not for people like me, anyway. I could imagine what Mum would have said. Get your head out of the clouds and concentrate on the real world. It was just a shame that the real world wasn't much fun. The sound of a kerfuffle to my right snapped me out of my daydreams. I pushed away from the wall and stared, open-mouthed, at the sight of 2 men, one dark-haired and one fair, dressed as soldiers, angrily pushing and shoving each other at the far end of the platform. Was this part of their act? Funny sort of act if it was, especially when they must have realised there were children about. I looked round at the other actors, but they were taking no notice. So it was part of the act, then? Surely they'd at least look a bit alarmed if not. And Perks was nowhere in sight, so I couldn't ask him. The stragglers would come out of the toilets at any moment, and the last thing I wanted them to see was 2 grown men in fancy dress having a punch-up. Since no one else seemed remotely interested, it was up to me. Great. I rushed up to the soldiers, my heart thudding as I noticed the very real anger in the fair-haired man's eyes. Excuse me. You're a liar, Ronnie Smith. She wouldn't have looked twice at you. Besides, she was loyal to me, was my Lily. Yeah, right. Loyal to all of us was Lily. One at a time, like. You take that back or I'll kill you. The fair-haired soldier aimed a punch at the dark-haired one. His fist landed on Ronnie Smith's cheek, confirming they weren't acting. Fancy behaving like that when you worked with the public. What if Immy had waited with me and seen and heard all this? Oi, there are children about. What the hell do you think you're doing? The fair-haired soldier gave me a fleeting glance. Then, dropping his fist, he stepped back and stared at me. The one called Ronnie Smith rubbed his cheek and watched me through narrowed eyes. Are you talking to us? No, I'm talking to that unicorn over there. Seriously? I added, as they both looked round in surprise. Look, there are children. I noticed the remaining pupils were now on the platform. Mrs. Ledbury had returned and was clearly doing another head count. Her gaze fell on me, and she pointed to the arch which led to the car park. Bus is leaving in a minute, she called. I nodded. Be right there. As Mrs. Ledbury turned back to the kids, I glared at the soldiers, who looked dazed. You see? Children. Well, I said, nodding at the fair-haired man. I know he's called Ronnie Smith, but what's your name? For a moment he gaped at me. Then, falteringly, he replied, Bill Fairfax. And who's your manager? Our manager? You mean our superior officer? I rolled my eyes. Very funny. I mean, who's in charge of you? Who employs you? You must have a supervisor of some sort. Or should I go straight to Sir Lawrence? The 2 men stared at each other, then at me. Were they really that gormless? Or were they having me on? Exasperated, I said, Oh, for goodness sake, fine, I'll speak to Sir Lawrence then. I'm sure someone can tell me where to find him. Slowly, Bill Fairfax said, Are you really talking to us? Well, who else? But my voice trailed off as I experienced the weirdest feeling. A chill ran up my spine and along my shoulder blades, making me shudder. A vague memory stirred, but I couldn't pin down what it was. I swallowed, suddenly feeling a bit nauseated. "Miss Chase, what are you doing? The bus will leave without us," Mrs. Ledbury called from further up the platform. She sounded impatient. I shook my head, wondering what the heck was wrong with me. "Coming!" Without so much as another glance at the two actors, I hurried to join the class. Chapter 2. The little crimson and ivory vintage bus trundled along the country lanes, and I leaned back in my seat and stared out of the window in delight. My shoulders dropped, and the muscles in my neck began to relax. Whatever that weird feeling had been at the station, I was fine now. How could I not be with views like these? The glorious Cotswolds, cornflower blue skies over rolling green hills, pastures where sheep, cows and horses grazed, and verges bright with daffodils adding a splash of sunshine to the landscape. "Are you all right, Callie?" I turned to Diana, surprised. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" She shook her head. "Just wondered, you seemed a bit tense when we left the station." Tense hadn't been the word. I wondered what word would do justice to the feeling I'd experienced as I'd stood on the platform with those two men. For a moment there, I'd felt real fear, and a weird sensation of familiarity as something stirred within me. Something I used to know. But what? Then again, I'd always had an overactive imagination. One of my clearest memories of Mum had been her telling me off for it. "Stop daydreaming, love," she'd told me repeatedly. "Start living in the real world. Be normal." Mr. Gaskill leaned towards us from his seat across the aisle. "What do you think to this bus, then? Fantastic, isn't it? A 1946 Leyland Tiger. I checked up on it when I came here to do a site visit." Diana rolled her eyes and nudged me. "Very cute," I agreed, ignoring Diana. Mr. Gaskill was right. This vintage bus was like something you'd see on a period drama. I could imagine it trundling through the dales on All Creatures Great and Small. There was even a conductor wandering up and down the aisle with his ticket machine, having a friendly chat with the kids. And wasn't the station great? Those characters in their First World War outfits, and the vintage tea shop. There's another one in the village, you know, with a World War II theme. It's right by the... He broke off, as, unaccountably, I shivered again. "Are you all right?" "To be honest," I said, "I was just wondering whether to report those two actors who were fighting on the platform to their boss." Mr. Gaskill's eyes widened. "What two actors? Are you sure they were fighting? Maybe it was part of a performance." "It wasn't," I assured him. "I don't want to get them into trouble, but it's not right. They must have seen the kids arrive on the platform, and they should have shown more restraint, don't you think?" "Certainly. Is that what you were doing then? We wondered what was keeping you." "Yes. What do you think? Should I report them?" "I suppose we ought to. It could have got out of hand. You know how fights can escalate, and it would have been a disaster if the children had seen it or been hurt by one of them. Imagine if they went home and told their parents." He shuddered at the horror of it all. "Good grief, that would be all we needed. No, there's no question about it, Callie. You should definitely report them." "Who to, though?" "I suppose Sir Lawrence Davenport himself has overall control. After all, it's his estate." He frowned. "The booking was made through his office at Harling Hall, so there must be a secretary or a manager or someone. I'll email them when we get back." I wasn't so sure that was a good idea. What if Sir Lawrence sacked the actors? I'd hate to have that on my conscience. I knew all too well what it was like to be broke. Of course, they needed to understand that their behaviour was unacceptable, but I didn't want them to end up in the job centre because of me. "It's okay," I said, deciding it would be better if I spoke to someone in Sir Lawrence's office in person so I could stress I wasn't looking for him to fire them. "I'll do it. I'll go to Harling Hall today. I was the one who saw them fighting after all." "Ooh, are we here, sir?" There was a chorus of excited cries as the bus turned right off the main road, and we spotted a large sign at the roadside which read, "Historic Woodland, Heritage Site, Rowan Vale Living History Village." I suspected the excitement was because the kids were dying to stretch their legs and run around a bit, rather than because they were thrilled to be visiting what was essentially a huge museum. "Settle down, please," Mr. Gaskill said loudly. "We're nearly there, so I'm sure you can sit quietly for a little longer." The bus trundled along a long, straight road, edged on both sides by woodland, which Mr. Gaskill told us rather pompously was called Quicken-Tree Avenue, and ran for almost 2 miles. "Quicken-Tree," he added, "is an old name for the Rowan. We'll be turning off for Rowan Vale Village about halfway down, though." "How come there are cars on this road?" Diana asked suddenly. "Thought they were banned." Mr. Gaskill gave the patient sigh of one who'd already explained all this to us. "It's the actual village of Rowan Vale where cars aren't permitted, and there are no coaches allowed on the estate at all, hence the coach park at the railway station. There's a large car park just past the turn-off to the village for visitors who haven't travelled by train." "Oh," Diana said, "I get it." Shaking his head slightly, Mr. Gaskill leaned towards me again. "If you want to visit the estate office first, it's fine by me, but I'll still put a complaint in an email," he said in a low voice before settling back in his seat. The bus turned down a lane on the left-hand side of the road, and I spotted a sign which read, "Rowan Vale Village, permitted vehicles only." After a few moments, the woodland gave way to open fields and farmland, then some buildings came into sight, and I spotted a church steeple in the distance. The murmuring from the children grew louder, and I noticed Mrs. Ledbury shrugging on her jacket in preparation. "Look, we're passing Harling Hall now." Mr. Gaskill nodded at the window. "You can pop by later, when the rest of us have our lunch. That okay?" "Will do," I said. Who needed to eat anyway? I peered out of the window, trying to see Harling Hall. I'd skimmed over its description on the estate website, but knew it had been built in the late 16th century by the Harling family who owned the village at the time. The house was surrounded by a stone wall, and the bus passed the gates far too quickly for me to catch more than a brief glimpse of multiple chimneys before it was lost to my sight. I supposed I'd see it up close soon enough. When I went to cause trouble for 2 young lads and got them fired. Possibly. Oh, heck. I was a horrible person. Maybe I should have kept my mouth shut after all. We'd been in Rowan Vale for just over 2 hours, and I'd already fallen in love with the village, which was breathtakingly beautiful, with its honeystone cottages, 13th century church, and stunning surroundings. A golden wall of daffodils graced the banks of the River Farron, a shallow body of water, more like a wide stream than a river, which ran through the centre of Rowan Vale, crisscrossed at regular intervals by little stone footbridges. I only wished I could have explored the whole village in depth, but we had a schedule, and there was to be no deviation. The school excursion was focused on 2 places, Rowan Farm, a real working farm on the outskirts of the village, run as it would have been during the Second World War, and Ashcroft Mill, a former working mill which had now been turned into a museum of life in Rowan Vale over the centuries. It had a whole section devoted to the 1940s, as well as a vintage wartime tea shop and a bakery in the building attached to it. Both places, it was felt, would aid the class with their project on home life during the war. If there was enough time after their tour of the museum, the children would be able to visit some of the shops in the village, which were replicas of ones that used to serve the villagers in bygone eras. Rowan Farm consisted of a beautiful old farmhouse set in acres of prime Cotswold land. It was, as one of the land girls who worked there explained to the children, a mixed farm, growing crops as well as raising animals. It had been fun to find 2 young women dressed in dungarees, sturdy shoes and dark green jerseys, playing the role of land girls with obvious relish. The one who spoke to the kids introduced herself as Erin and seemed more than happy to explain about life on a farm in the 1940s. It was good to see Immy listening avidly to her stories. As well as being shown around the farm, we were taken into the farmhouse itself, which had been decorated exactly as it would have been during the Second World War. There was even a radio playing old music, with the occasional news broadcast interrupting the songs. The farmer's wife, who introduced herself as Betty, was busy baking bread and told us all how lucky she felt that, unlike the poor unfortunates in the cities and towns, they were never short of food at Rowan Farm. She made the children laugh as she told them about the day the two land girls had arrived at the farm from the city. Dolled up to the nines with their fancy nail polishes and their hair all done up and not a clue about life in the country. I noticed the rapt expression on Immy's face as both Erin and Betty told them about the two German prisoners of war who worked there too. She was fascinated by this, and she wasn't the only one. The boys clearly perked up at the thought of German prisoners. I had to admit, Erin and Betty were very convincing. I almost believed the stories were true myself. We wandered round the farmhouse, noting the old-fashioned decor and furniture, examining the ration books and exclaiming at how little people had to eat in those days. We were then escorted to the adjoining dairy where the other land girl, Rissa, was busy churning butter. After that, the class headed outside again. We led the children to one of the old barns, which had been turned into a sort of dining room. Union flag bunting had been strung from the beams, and there appeared to be a sort of stage at one end of the building. Picnic tables had been set up for visitors to sit and eat their packed lunches, and we quickly settled the children into their seats. Mr. Gaskell and Mrs. Ledbury seemed pleased that the class were far more engaged with the visit now than they had been when we arrived. Just as I was about to dip into my backpack for my lunchbox, Mr. Gaskell suggested I might like to slip away to Harling Hall and report his two badly behaved employees at the station to the estate office. Despite my rumbling stomach, I agreed. Far better that I explained what had happened to the manager rather than Mr. Gaskell sending him an official email. At least I could try to ensure that the two young men were reprimanded but didn't lose their jobs. Could you tell Immy where I am if she asks? Although don't mention the fighting soldiers, just say, I've gone to have a quick look around the grounds of the manor house. I doubt she'll ask too many questions.
Of course, no problem. Let me know the outcome, though I'm sure a strongly worded email from the school will ensure they take this seriously if appropriate action isn't taken. I'm quite certain Sir Lawrence wouldn't want the reputation of his business damaged.
Feeling thoroughly uncomfortable, I headed through the farm gates and wandered along the lane back towards the village, the distinctive red brick chimney of the 18th century mill and the spire of the church my points of reference. The more I thought about it, the worse I felt. I hated the idea of getting anyone into trouble, especially the two young men who couldn't have been more than 20, if that. I'd have to be very diplomatic with whoever dealt with staffing issues, and while I realised that Ronnie and Bill, if those were their real names, needed to be reprimanded, I really hoped the punishment wouldn't be too harsh. I wouldn't have thought employment was that easy to come by around here. Lost in thought, I barely noticed I was being followed at first. I gradually became aware of a hum of voices and some giggles, and as the sound permeated my thoughts, I turned to see who was following me. Two young boys and a girl, probably between 6 and 10, were creeping behind me, and, judging by their expressions, they were plotting mischief. As I frowned at them, the girl stuck her tongue out. I decided to ignore them and carried on walking. But within seconds, the children had run past and began walking backwards in front of me, pulling faces and mocking me. I stopped and put my hands on my hips. Okay, that's enough of that, don't you think? The children straightened, a look of shock on their faces. The boys glanced around as if checking for someone, then turned back to me, open-mouthed. One of them, the eldest, nudged the girl. She's talking to us, Florrie. Don't be daft. The girl sounded dubious. Are you? I don't see any other children being rude to me. I glanced at my watch. 12:10. Why aren't you in school? I asked, noting at the same time that they were all in costume. The boys were in grubby white shirts that looked far too big for them. They wore equally shabby, buff-coloured trousers, but my biggest concern was that only the older boy was wearing shoes. heavy brown ones with a low heel that appeared slightly too large for him. The younger boy was barefoot. Both had matted, light brown hair that fell almost to their shoulders. The little girl looked very different. She had long black hair in 2 plaits and was wearing a cotton print dress, a clearly hand-knitted cardigan and, of all things, a pair of black wellies. She was clearly supposed to be from the 1940s or 1950s. OK, so maybe their parents worked for Sir Lawrence and had dressed their children in costume for the fun of it, but this was surely taking things too far. The little boys shouldn't have been running around without shoes on, and why weren't they at school? Unless their Easter holidays started earlier than the ones in our area. "Don't go to school," the girl said, tilting her chin defiantly at me. The boys stared dumbly at me, their eyes wide. They looked as if they needed a good bath. "What do you mean, you don't go to school?" I asked suspiciously. "Are you home taught?" "We just don't go. Don't have to. You can't make us." She grinned widely, revealing a gap between her 2 front teeth, her eyes flashing a challenge. "Besides, there'd be no point. These 2 can't even read, so they wouldn't learn much, would they?" "They can't?" I frowned. "Are you having me on? Where do you live?" "Mind your beeswax," the girl said. "Got nothing to do with you." "If you're not at school and these boys can't read or write, not to mention one of them hasn't even got any shoes on, then it's got everything to do with me. Whether you realise it or not, you need protecting." The younger boy's face crumpled, and I crouched down, feeling guilty that I'd obviously scared him. "Don't look so worried. You're not in any trouble, but I would like to speak to your mum and dad." Looking into his big brown eyes, my heart thumped, and for some reason I shuddered. The prickling sensation I'd experienced earlier at the station was back again, along with something else. Something I couldn't quite catch hold of and wasn't sure I wanted to. The girl yanked the little boy away and said fiercely, "Clear off and leave us alone. I'm going to tell Laurie about you. He'll sort you out good and proper." With that, the children ran away, leaving me bewildered and not a little worried. Laurie? Could that by any chance be Sir Lawrence? Well, that had made up my mind once and for all. Things were very wrong in Rowan Vale, and I was going to have strong words with the manager about his staff, not to mention the welfare of their children. As I carried on towards the hall, I wondered, with a sudden shiver, why I couldn't get one name out of my mind. The boys had called the girl Florrie, but no one had mentioned what they were called. So why was David echoing through my head? Chapter 3. Florrie. "He is, you know. He's going to kiss her." John wrinkled his nose. "If they do, I'm out of here." Florrie's eyes narrowed as she watched the man and woman just a few feet away from them, utterly oblivious to the fact that they were under observation by a trio of amused children who were sitting cross-legged on the grass, listening to every word the couple were saying. Neither Bram nor Rissa had been blessed with the gift, which was a very good thing as far as Florrie was concerned, and luckily she, John and Robert had no living descendants or close relatives who might be able to see them either. They were pretty much free to come and go as they pleased, and spying on unsuspecting courting couples was one of the few perks of an afterlife that could, in Florrie's opinion, be way too boring for her liking. Of course, if all that kissing business started, the trio would always make a hasty retreat. Who wanted to see all that yucky stuff? In her opinion, though, they were safe with Bram and Rissa. Whatever John thought, she was convinced that Dutchman Bram, who masqueraded as a German prisoner of war, had no interest in the land girl from the farm. He had far more sense than that. After all, he must know she was still sweet on Brodie. Everyone did. "Is he heck?" she said scornfully. "He don't like her very much at all, and who can blame him? Done up like a dog's dinner to work on a farm." Her voice trailed off as she recalled her mother's voice suddenly. It had been such a long time since she'd heard it, but just then her words came back to her with painful clarity. "That Elsie Jones at number 4, all dressed up like a dog's dinner. Does she think we're daft? We all know who she's off to see." "Why isn't she at work anyway?" she finished dully. Skiving, no doubt. Someone should warn 'em at the farm about her. I think she's pretty, Robert said softly. All that yellow hair, it's like a cloud of butter. Bleach, Florrie said dismissively. And how can you have a cloud of butter? Are you soft in the head? Anyway, what do you know about it? She nodded towards Bram and Rissa. Look at her, staring at him, all daft and soppy, pouting her lips like that. Looks like a goldfish. She mimed a goldfish opening and closing its mouth, which made Robert laugh. Well, I think they'll get married, John persisted. I'm glad. I like it when people are happy. Sometimes, Florrie said darkly. I wonder why I bother with you. Bet he kisses her in the next couple of minutes, John said, as if determined to wind her up. 10 Bob says he won't, Florrie retorted. She wasn't sure how much 10 Bob was, but the way her mum used to go on about the cost of everything, she suspected it was a lot. You haven't got 10 Bob, John pointed out, which infuriated her so much that she was tempted to slap him. A moment later, she forgot her anger and gave a triumphant whoop as Bram got to his feet, bid a casual farewell to Rissa, who gave a heavy sigh before tucking into her packed lunch, and headed off across the field, taking a shortcut back to the farmhouse. Told you. Well, that's 20 minutes we'll never get back, Florrie said, even though she had no real idea how long they'd been watching the couple. She jumped up, deciding to find something more interesting to do with her time. Where are you going? Robert was soon at her side, as expected. Finding something better to do, Florrie told him, walking directly through the closed gate of the field into the lane. She jerked her thumb behind her. Your brother can stay there and moon over his girlfriend all he likes. She's not my girlfriend. John had rushed up behind her, as she well knew, and she thought with some satisfaction that, if he'd been able to blush, his face would be bright red now. He was very easy to embarrass. Just 'cause I said she looked nice once doesn't mean... Florrie, however, had lost interest. She'd spotted someone new walking down the lane just ahead of them, and her eyes gleamed with curiosity. Tourist, she said. The three of them grinned at each other, and Florrie began to prance behind the young woman, swinging her arms in an exaggerated fashion and wiggling her hips. Robert laughed, and Florrie responded by flicking her plaits back. She could always rely on Robert's devotion. John was sometimes more difficult to keep in check, but she had ways of dealing with him if he got too independent. She was momentarily distracted from her thoughts when the young woman stopped and turned round. For a second, Florrie could have sworn she was looking directly at them, but of course she couldn't be. Just to be certain, she stuck her tongue out at the visitor, who didn't respond but turned and continued walking. Knowing she was safe, Florrie winked at Robert and John, and the three of them ran past the woman, then turned to face her. Walking backwards, they pulled faces and hurled insults at her, mocking her dark auburn hair, her clothing. She was wearing a black jacket and a pair of jeans, which Florrie knew would make Agnes shudder, and even the way she walked. Suddenly the woman stopped and put her hands on her hips. Okay, that's enough of that, don't you think? Florrie wasn't quite sure what to make of that. Momentarily stunned, she was annoyed when John nudged her and informed her the woman was talking to them. Don't be daft. For once, though, Florrie wasn't so sure of herself. She eyed the woman nervously. Are you? I don't see any other children being rude to me. Why aren't you in school? Florrie could feel Robert trembling beside her. John murmured, Uh-oh. Who did this woman think she was, frightening them like that? And anyway, how could she see them? It didn't make sense. Florrie decided the best form of defence was attack. Don't go to school, she said defiantly. What do you mean you don't go to school? Are you home-taught? Florrie wasn't entirely sure what that meant. We just don't go. Don't have to. You can't make us. Besides, there'd be no point. These two can't even read, so they wouldn't learn much, would they? They can't? Are you having me on? Where do you live? Mind your beeswax, Florrie snapped. Got nothing to do with you. If you're not at school and these boys can't read or write, not to mention one of them hasn't even got any shoes on, then it's got everything to do with me. Whether you realise it or not, you need protecting." Florrie watched, feeling increasingly annoyed as the woman crouched down and spoke to Robert. "Don't look so worried. You're not in any trouble, but I would like to speak to your mum and dad." John swallowed hard, and Florrie saw the tears well up in Robert's eyes. How dare this woman mention the boys' mum and dad? What did she want to go and upset them for? Who did she think she was, anyway? Grabbing Robert's arm, she yelled, "Clear off and leave us alone. I'm going to tell Laurie about you. He'll sort you out good and proper." She almost dragged the boys away, and together they ran down the lane and through the village before finally huddling together behind the ancient wishing well on the green. Even if the woman came this way, she wouldn't spot them from the path. Florrie wasn't used to feeling alarmed, and she didn't like it. "How could she see us, Florrie?" John whispered, clearly as scared as she was. "I thought only Laurie could see us among the living ones." Florrie had assumed the same, and it deeply unnerved her that this stranger had proved her wrong. "I don't know," she admitted, hating having no answer for them. She straightened suddenly, determined they weren't going to see any weakness in her. "But I'm off to tell Laurie about her. He needs to know. Come on, let's go to the big house." Robert and John shrank away. "We don't go there, you know that." "I don't see why not," she grumbled. "You're such babies." "No, we're not," John snapped. "You're just mean. You know why we don't go near the big house. He might be there." "I've told you loads of times. He never comes to the house. It's not my fault if you don't believe me." Florrie felt increasingly flustered. Today was not going according to plan. First some weird woman who could see them, and now John and Robert refusing to do as she said. She wasn't sure what to do about any of it. Robert sniffed and rubbed his nose, and John put a protective arm around his little brother. Florrie's mouth tightened. "Oh no!" she cried. John and Robert jumped in fright. "What is it? Is it that woman?" John looked wildly around him. "It's him?" Florrie gasped, clutching her chest dramatically. "It's Pillory Pete!" "No!" Robert wailed. "Florrie, make him go away." "You'd better run and hide," she said. "I'll try to distract him." The boys didn't need telling twice. They took to their heels and fled, leaving a grinning Florrie behind. That, she thought, would teach them. They were too soft for their own good. And she was doing them a favour, really. They'd have to toughen up one day. It wasn't like they were all alone in the world either. Not like her. They had each other, just like Henry and Francis. She had no one. Watching the boys disappear into the distance, Florrie sighed, then turned towards the house. Time to tell Laurie about the interloper. And she'd spice the story up a bit, just to rile everyone up. Agnes would be furious by the time she'd finished, she thought with some satisfaction. Feeling a bit better, she fairly sped along the path, a thin, running figure with bobbing plaits and ridiculously out-of-place black wellies. Chapter 4. I'd half expected to find the gates to Harling Hall locked, but they weren't. In fact, there was nothing to stop me heading up the drive to the house, and I had to admit I'd sort of hoped there would be. I'd taken a long, slow walk there, unable to shake the feeling of dread as I made my way through the village. Now, as I approached the imposing Elizabethan manor house, I was half tempted to forget the whole thing, even though I knew I had no choice. It wasn't so much about the actors any longer. I was seriously worried about the welfare of those kids, even if they had creeped me out. Harling Hall was a beautiful 3-storey E-shaped building built of golden Cotswold stone with a multitude of stone mullioned windows, chimneys, gables, and a large, solid wooden door which loomed up before me all too soon. I couldn't see any signs directing me to an office, so could only presume it was inside the house. Steadying my nerves, I lifted the heavy brass door knocker and banged it loudly 3 times against the wood. After a few moments, the door opened and I got another surprise. The man who stood there was probably around my age, 30-ish, tall and broad-shouldered, with very dark, curly, close-cropped hair, and piercing blue eyes. Wow. I'm here to—
You'd better come in,
he said curtly, opening the door wide. Not what I'd expected, and, quite frankly, rather rude. Nevertheless, I stepped inside the house, finding myself in an impressive hallway with a flagstone floor and a sweeping L-shaped staircase to the right. The man closed the door behind me. Didn't he even want to know who I was or what I wanted? Come to that, who was he? Dressed in faded jeans and a white t-shirt, he clearly wasn't the butler. I assumed he must work in the office.
Come with me,
he said, and led me to one of the doors on the left of the hall. Wondering if he thought I was here to do some cleaning or something, I followed him into a room that appeared to be a study. The walls were lined with bookcases filled with ledgers and files, and there was a large oak desk at one end of the room. An elderly man with surprisingly thick white hair was sitting on a Chesterfield sofa which faced the desk, his mouth curved into a welcoming smile.
Please take a seat,
he said, patting the space on the sofa next to him. The younger man said nothing but headed round the desk and plunked himself in the chair, where he faced us both, unsmiling and as far from welcoming as it was possible to be. Wow again, but in an entirely different way. He might be hot as hell, but he was a miserable so-and-so. I sat down, thoroughly confused by now. I'm not here to clean, I said, in case that's what they were thinking. The elderly man laughed.
I'm well aware of that. I should imagine you're here to complain. Am I right?
I thought that assumption said it all. Do you get a lot of complaints?
Few, if any, he said with a shrug. But you've had quite a time of it today, what with one thing and another.
Is this the estate office, then? I asked hesitantly.
I suppose it is. I'm Sir Lawrence Davenport, he said, although please call me Laurie, everyone does. And you are—
I swallowed. I really hadn't expected to meet the big boss, and it had quite thrown me. Callie, I said. Callie Chase.
I'm delighted to meet you, Callie. And this jolly chap here is my grandson, Brodie.
I glanced at Prince Charming, who glowered back. Why do I get the feeling you were expecting me? I asked suspiciously.
Because we were.
Sir Lawrence's eyes, almost as blue as his grandson's, twinkled with amusement.
Bill and Ronnie came to see me earlier in rather a state with themselves. I understand you really tore a strip off them. Gave them quite a fright.
Yes, well, I couldn't help feeling a bit annoyed that the two young men had got to Sir Lawrence first, though I couldn't really blame them. They'd have wanted to put their side of the story to their boss before he heard my version of events. Look, I don't want to get anyone sacked or anything like that, but they were openly fighting on the station platform. I was with a group of school children who could have walked out of the toilets at any moment and witnessed the whole thing. Imagine if they had. Sir Lawrence nodded gravely.
Imagine if they had indeed.
He glanced at his grandson.
Wouldn't that have been something?
When Brodie didn't reply, he sighed.
Bill and Ronnie are always fighting, I'm afraid. It's what they do best.
I'd assumed it was a one-off, and I didn't like the casual way Sir Lawrence seemed to accept their behaviour. And you think that's okay, do you? He didn't answer the question.
Would you like some tea, Callie?
No, I said, feeling crosser by the minute. He clearly wasn't taking me seriously. In fact, he seemed to find the whole situation amusing. And to think I'd been worried he'd be too hard on his stuff. Remembering my manners, I added quickly, but thank you. I'll have to get back to the others soon, so can we get on with discussing what happened at the station?
Certainly.
He leaned back on the sofa, suddenly more serious.
Where are you from, Callie?
What on earth did that have to do with it? East Yorkshire, originally, I said reluctantly, but I don't see—
Interesting. Have you any connection to the Cotswolds at all, to this area in particular?
I glanced at Brodie, who was leaning forward, listening intently. No, look, Sir Lawrence.
Laurie, please.
Laurie, I said uncertainly. I really must get back to the kids, but speaking of kids, were you aware that there are at least 3 school-age children running around this village in period costume? One of them didn't have any shoes on, and quite honestly, both boys were filthy. The girl who was with them told me they didn't go to school and said the boys can't even read or write. Surely that can't be true.
I've already heard about your encounter with the children from Agnes, he admitted. She's not impressed, but then she only heard Florence's side of the story, and the dear child can be a little, economical with the truth. Looks like an angel, but John and Robert don't stand a chance, do they? All the same, I wouldn't worry too much about them.
I gathered Florence was Florrie, but who the heck was Agnes? And why was Sir Lawrence telling me not to worry? How could I not? At the very least, those children were being neglected, and he didn't seem at all concerned. Neither did Brodie, who sat there, silent and stony-faced, and as much use as a chocolate fireguard. Sir Lawrence got up, opened the study door, and called into the hallway.
Agnes, Aubrey, could you spare me a moment, please?
He left the door open and sat down again.
Forgive me, Callie, but I really do need to see this for myself,
he said kindly. See what? I had no idea what was going on anymore. This meeting wasn't going at all as I'd expected. Maybe I should have let Mr. Gaskell deal with the matter, as he'd suggested. Sir Lawrence clearly had no intention of sacking Bill and Ronnie, so my worries had been for nothing, and now I was stuck here when I could have been eating lunch with Immy. Curse my conscientious nature. My eyes widened as 2 middle-aged people entered the study, presumably Agnes and Aubrey. The man had dark grey-streaked hair, almost white at the temples, with a rather impressive beard, moustache and sideburns. He was dressed like a Victorian gentleman in a black frock coat and grey trousers, with a stiffly starched white collar and a wide blue necktie tied in a loopy bow. As if that wasn't surreal enough, the woman appeared to have been called from her bed, dressed in a way I could only imagine Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice would have been, in a white cotton nightdress, woolen stockings and a flannel bed jacket, brown ringlets peeping out from beneath a white linen nightcap. I almost laughed at how ridiculous this whole thing was, but my amusement quickly died when the woman, who I presumed was Agnes, glared at me with such contempt that I reared away from her in shock. "Is this her?" she demanded.
Come now, Agnes. The man, presumably Aubrey, patted her arm. Let's not overreact. We should hear what she has to say for herself.
Should we indeed? The woman fairly bristled with indignation. And I suppose you think it's all right for a perfect stranger to accost our daughter in the street? Oh, heck, this was all I needed. So let me guess, you're that little girl's mother. Florence, did you call her? I asked, turning to Sir Lawrence. I simply couldn't think of him as Laurie, no matter how much he insisted. He was looking far too pleased with himself, which only annoyed me further. I think her friends called her Florrie anyway. Agnes tutted. Friends indeed, and her name is Florence. Sir Lawrence raised his eyebrows at her.
Why don't you formally introduce yourself to our guest? He suggested to her. This is Callie Chase. She is, indeed, the lady who spoke with Florence earlier.
Spoke with her? Is that what she calls it? Downright rude, I call it, to speak in such an offensive manner to a child. Have you no manners, girl? Agnes clearly wasn't in awe of Sir Lawrence. I wondered if she was a relative of his, rather than an employee, as I'd first assumed. I don't think it's my manners you should be concerned with, I said indignantly. If you'd seen and heard the way... I swallowed nervously as the man moved to my side, staring down at me with obvious curiosity. Well, well, he said, glancing at Sir Lawrence. So she's the one, eh?
It would seem so, Sir Lawrence told him. Not only did she encounter the children, but Bill and Ronnie fighting at the station.
The man tutted.
Typical of those two, shockingly bad behaviour, a disgrace to the uniform.
He studied me for a moment, as if mentally examining me for faults, then gave a little bow.
Aubrey Wyndham, very pleased to meet you, Miss Chase. We've been rather anxious of late. Time ticking on and all that. Splendid news that you've been found at last.
What do you mean, found? Quite honestly, I was beginning to wonder if everyone in this village was insane.
This can't be happening, it's too much, Agnes groaned. It can't be not her.
She stared down at me with distaste, after the way she spoke to Florence.
The point is, my dear, said Aubrey gently, she did speak to Florence, and to Bill and Ronnie, and we all know what that means.
And to you,
Sir Lawrence added.
I really don't see what more proof we need.
He turned to me, understanding in his eyes.
You must be thoroughly confused by all this, but I'm so very grateful you came here today. You really are the answer to our prayers.
Over by the desk, I heard a grunt from Brodie. Then he got up and strode out of the study without saying a word. He might have been gorgeous, but he was the surliest man I'd ever met, and that was saying something, given the childhood I'd had.
Bad form, that,
Aubrey said, shaking his head. Agnes sniffed. Can you blame him? Answer to our prayers, indeed. There must be someone more suitable than her, surely, Laurie, dear. Mr. Wyndham, tell him. Aubrey shook his head regretfully.
Laurie's quite right. With all due respect, time is running out.
He gave Sir Lawrence an apologetic look.
Absolutely, I'm 84, and I may not have long left to carry this out. Callie fits all the criteria. I must do this, Agnes, I'm sorry.
By now, confusion had started to give way to genuine fear. Either this lot were putting on one heck of a show for me, or they all needed serious psychiatric help. I decided that whatever was going on in this village, I was leaving. Maybe I'd judged Brodie too harshly. Maybe he felt the same way, and that was why he'd left so abruptly. I got to my feet. I can't stay here any longer. The school will email you, but right now, I need to get back to the kids.
Good,
said Agnes.
But you can't,
Aubrey protested.
Callie, could you please spare a few more minutes?
Sir Lawrence pleaded.
I wouldn't ask, but this is so important.
As I shook my head and moved forward, intent on getting out of there fast, Agnes stepped in front of me, her arms folded. Rude! Sir Lawrence is speaking to you, girl. I was now in no doubt that everyone in Rowan Vale was bonkers. Sorry, I told Agnes, but I'm a busy woman. I put my hand on her arm to gently but firmly manoeuvre her out of the way, but my hand grasped only air. I was clearly hallucinating. I tried again with the same result, and suddenly that awful feeling returned, the prickling sensation. Icy fingers running down my spine and across my shoulders, making me shudder. David. Chapter 5. I barely had time to register the name or give any thought to what it meant, as Agnes gave me a smug look and said, You won't budge me, just try it. Overwhelmed by a feeling I couldn't put a name to, I dropped back onto the sofa. Aubrey tutted. Really, Agnes, you could have been gentler with her. After the way she spoke to Florence, I think not, Mr. Wyndham, and I would thank you to put your daughter first for once. Aubrey cleared his throat but said nothing. Tentatively, I reached out to touch his sleeve. When my fingers passed through it, I gasped and covered my face with my hands.
Oh God, I've lost the plot. Not at all, Sir Lawrence said kindly. You have nothing to be afraid of, I promise you.
Slowly I spread my fingers and peered out at him.
Are you a ghost?
I asked him fearfully. In reply, he patted my arm. He was solid, real. As for the other two, I reluctantly lowered my hands.
But these two are,
I whispered.
Aren't they?
Let me introduce you to Aubrey Wyndham and his wife, Agnes Ashcroft,
His wife? I thought that a bit odd. She appeared to be dressed in Regency or Georgian style, whereas he was almost certainly from the Victorian era. So how did that work? And how could Florrie be their daughter when she was obviously from the 1940s or 1950s? They must have recognised the doubt in my voice, because Agnes scowled and Aubrey shuffled awkwardly as Sir Lawrence said hastily,
"That's right. Look, Callie, what about that cup of tea now?"
I couldn't reply. Fear and confusion seemed to have robbed me of all ability to speak.